Welcome to the Heart of Soul podcast, an exploration of who you are, what you are, and why you are, offering new ways to investigate age-old questions at the heart of you. Hi, it's Joseph, and thanks for listening to the Heart of Soul podcast. Today, the split between humanity and divinity. Yes, there's more to say about that. The nature of conditioning. Yes, there's more to say about that too. The ramifications of the self as sacred and essentially emotive, and of course, much, much more. Thanks so much for listening, or if you're on YouTube, for watching. Greetings and welcome forward, everybody. You are listening to the Heart of Soul podcast. I say that as much for me as for you, to ground us in space and time. That's what's happening right now. Hello, Stace.
Hello.
Of course, by the time you're listening to it, we're not doing it anymore. So that's
damn that lag time. But thank God for it, right? That's an interesting support in the greater reality of things that about time. It allows us to do this and then have it show up later after it's been doctored and appropriately packaged.
Yeah, except I rarely edit these at all, thank God, because I wouldn't have the time or the patience. Because we just rock so hard, we don't need editing. That's the secret to producing great content, folks. Don't require editing. Just get it right the first time.
Well, and you know what? Even when you don't get it right the first time, it's still more alive and real then. So it's perfect. Why would anyone want to edit a podcast?
Yeah, exactly. It makes it far more real and alive. So we're talking about what is the experience of any amount of embodied identity today. And as Stace was saying before we hit the record button, this is something we've talked about here and there, but just like, there's going to be so much to talk about, like, what's it like to be enlightened? Many Zen students have asked for, 1,000+ years, and what kind of oblique or shaming answers would they get? And we'll probably talk about why they've gotten oblique and non-specific answers, but hopefully give you some clear answers as well. So where should we start?
Well, from Identity's way of interacting with what we call our perception of reality, what the world, what Earth and all of its millennia of evolution has lacked is an appreciation for why we're actually in incarnative inhabitation of Earth. Why are we here?
Mm-hmm. I get where you're going. That's a really interesting place to start. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's we've had plenty of diagnoses of why we're here. Evolution will explain one way, just sort of the unfolding of survival of the fittest in that way. You've got all the religious and spiritual definitions. But if we start with this, why are we here? All these other institutions and millennial teachings have their answer. I'd like to start with what Identity's paradigm actually, why are we here? Mm-hmm. And it's actually quite straightforward to say, we're here to learn to embody the spiritual and the spiritual and the human. We're here to embody the divinity and the humanity as one gestaltic embodiment. That's why we're here. And now you have to start with that is really important, because upon that foundation, everything makes more sense than for something as complex as identity. I want to try to make it as unfoldingly clear and simple, which is not. The paradigm's not simple. Yeah. But in these terms, if our truth is we're here to embody divinity and humanity, are these two aspects of us as one aspect, not two. Okay, mm-hmm. And so if that's Identity's premise, then the next level of it is why has that been so difficult? Mm-hmm. Because we have an extremely tumultuous world, noisy and conflictive and biased and cruel and
Confused.
all confused. And these are all nice ways to say it. Uh, so obviously, we have not been given good guidance on how to embody in a single gestalt of our divinity and humanity at the same time. That's what we call the stage of identity inside us.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, we named the paradigm after the state that is the ultimate state of embodiment of the divine human or the human divinity, right? Human divinity is a good way to say it, because then we've got feet. The human is the adjective and divinity is the noun. And that's actually accurate metaphysically.
Yeah, Embodiment of the Divine Human was the subtitle of one of your books, I remember.
Yes, Embodiment of the Divine Human. So in this sense, with the state of the world as it is, if this is accurate, and this is all through identity's lens, of course, the state of the world simply has not been clearly instructed on how to embody that unity of divinity and humanity. If it did, we would not have the world we have right now.
Well,
right?
yeah, and then it's sort of implied, and if you guys have listened to even, I don't know, 5 or 10 other podcasts, you would maybe get this, but it bears mentioning. Most other paradigms are not, they might say that they want something like that, but observationally they don't. You know, like a devotional religion, for example, negativizes the human self as originally sinned or originally ignorant or fundamentally flawed in some way. I mean, that's like the whole class of devotional religions. And so it's not about embodying the sacredness of the human in any way. It's about escaping that. And then on the spiritual side, most spiritual paradigms, on the human side, most self-empowerment paradigms don't even subscribe to any amount of any spirituality. You know, it's just, what do you want your life to look like? And you are the sole author of that, which automatically excludes any divine influence. But it's really interesting. I was just talking to someone, a potential client, a day or two ago. It's really interesting how people have an intuitive sense that they want to embody that wholeness, the unity of human and spirit. So like when you offer that idea, they're like, oh yeah, I like that. But before you offer that idea, they're segmenting. So like the gentleman I was speaking to was very much inside a kind of, you know, personal development, self-empowerment paradigm. And his orientation is like, how do you want to feel? And what do you need to do to make that happen? Is sort of the governing dynamic. And that's squarely personhood. It's taking responsibility for your life and taking the steps to make that happen. And then when I started to offer the idea that, well, we're actually not really in control to the degree he's seeing it, he immediately agreed with me. But without seeing that what he'd said just a minute ago completely contradicted that they both can't go together. And it's really interesting because the soul intuitively is there and wants that wholeness, but if it doesn't have a way of talking about how they can go together, then it usually defaults to one or the other. Not the soul, the protector of the soul.
Exactly. And that's what I want to get to next. Exactly. Beautiful words. If we distill that down, we could say the reason we've not been given good direction on the main goal of combining divinity and humanity into one embodied gestalt is that we've had very incomplete and poor mapping of both the spiritual, the divine domain and the human domain. In the very simplest way of saying it, we've not mapped divinity, neither divinity nor humanity. What do those really entail? Mm-hmm. We've got all sorts of religious, theistic and humanistic, non-theistic, and spiritual East and West conversations about it. But identity offers that all the maps we've been given up until now all contain some element of truth, but mostly are bereft in 2/3 of their accuracy to the actual nature of divinity and the actual nature of our humanity. In other words, a humanistic empiricist would say that we're just animals with a top-heavy cortex, and lights go out at death, and there's only one life, and it's like a mayfly. That's it. And in that arc, you may as well grab ye rosebuds while you can get them, whatever rosebuds are, that way. So that's a map of the human that identity would say, nice try, but not accurate according to our vision and our felt reality that can all be self-verified. Each of these things I want to simply distill one to the next are all offered as things to self-verify, not to believe. I'm not outlining the dogma of identity here. I'm offering identity's map of the human and the divine, and then how does that lead to the experience? Mm-hmm. So we've not been given good, as Joseph just said, we've not been given good mapping of the divine. Let's start there for the moment. Western religion invents all the religions today, including the Eastern perspectives. All of them were incepted in a pre-psychological age. So that should tell us something. And yet the reason they're persisting into a post-psychological era is because of the way we've been taught to believe instead of actually encounter and embody.
I'm getting the image of, it's kind of like having an astronomical model that is pre-heliocentric. Like,
yes.
If you have a model for astronomy that still is making the assumption that the Earth is the center of the solar system, yes, right. Some of it might be right and useful, but I wouldn't design a space program around that. You're probably not going to end up where you want to go. So they're operating on literally an old model for reality. It's really limited.
So I don't want to go through all the, because we've talked about it in many podcasts, all these other spiritual positions and pictures of mapping of the ultimate state of consciousness, perhaps in the East, and the ultimate state of afterlife in the West. Identity summarizes them all as saying incomplete at best.
And we covered this. If you haven't listened to, I'd have to look where they are, the series on paradigmatic thinking that we did somewhere in between 10 and 20, I think. I don't know, somewhere in the first 20 episodes. Those really were intentionally done as a foundation for everything else. So if you haven't listened to those, you can stop right now and go back.
If you like.
And then come back.
We'll summarize it, though, in this straightforward, unfolding way. Okay. So identity offers that the picture of divinity is not a patriarchal white guy in the beard up in a cloud. It's not one life only, as many religions in the West hold it. It's not, doesn't have pet races that it bestows extra love juice toward and support. It doesn't need us to have anything between us and it, meaning it does not need, divinity doesn't need churches. It doesn't need dogma. It doesn't need any of these things.
It doesn't need to be served. It doesn't need to be glorified.
Obeyed. It doesn't want our glory. I mean, how many times does the word glory come up?
You serve the glory of God. That's what a lot of Christians think. I don't know what that means, but that's what they're supposed to do.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and in a post-psychological era, which Christianity in this case certainly wasn't, only an insecure God would need glory. I mean, wait, the anthropomorphic projections of these old axial age religion gods are so poorly in focus. The only thing they get right that divinity that identity offers they get right is that there is a divine being.
Yeah.
But the shape of it, the intent of it, the embodied way it relates to humanity.
Just to think about that one idea of projection, that the newest world religion happened 1,400 years before the concept of projection was even created, much less accepted. I mean,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
wow, to have a concept of what God is without having a concept of anthropomorphism and projection, that's, I mean, most people still don't get projection,
No,
and it's been
no,
around for
still.
120 years.
Yeah, yeah.
And look what those
We're only
people's lives are like and how much they distort reality.
when you think of we're only really a little over 1 century into post psychological awareness of how we operate psychologically,
Mm-hmm.
stacked up against what 100 centuries, 1,000 centuries.
I never really, I never had this thought before that the, I'm gonna see if I can get this into words. Um, in an objectivist world, when you're inside Christianity, Hinduism, whatever, those are objective realities that are top down and handed to you.
Yes.
That's,
Mm-hmm.
growing up, if you grow up inside that, your how you might be distorting reality vis-a-vis projection is a non-issue because there's an agreement about how everything is sort of a priori. But
Yes.
then when
Mm-hmm.
you introduce the subjectivistic phase of development and consciousness where we're in now, where the individual's perception of reality is up to them, now projection is a big issue because they
Yeah.
get to interpret. And that started in the Protestant Reformation. I'll interpret the Bible the way I want. Okay, you can
Right.
do that,
Mm-hmm.
parentheses, and you're going to run into a shit ton of projection and you're going to have to be responsible for that. Pro what?
Yeah.
That won't be invented for 500 years or 300 years, right? And that's where we are now. Okay, you all get to interpret reality however you want, but you're going to have to
Yep.
look at how you're doing that, and that involves understanding how projection works, and most people don't.
And boy, you've got to have curiosity to be able to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not just the lockstep. Every time, the whole idea of conditioning is still a very poorly understood. It's in the divine realm of our subjective definitions of how we encounter divinity.
Yeah.
Conditioning. Every time I hear the word conditioning, I immediately get Hitler standing on a platform and the army walking by in a parade with their arms out like this
Mm-hmm.
and goose stepping,
Mm-hmm.
and they're in complete unison. The army people they're walking in with a big kick up high with their leg, and they're doing this, and they're turned to this Führer, and that is such a beautiful picture of what conditioning is. It
Mm-hmm.
means that we are conditionable as consciousnesses to what we're taught when we're young, and a small percentage of the planet is in lockstep, literal unconscious lockstep to their conditioning, and can't get outside that there's anything else that might be
Yeah.
outside of what they were taught.
Yeah.
Uh,
And
it,
conditioning
it,
preceded the concept of projection. I think John Locke
yeah,
was one of the first philosophers that goes like not earlier than like 1750 or something. In Renaissance philosophy, they started to talk about that. And then that
yeah,
became the root, the basis of psychology. How does that work? How do you decondition? What's right?
right.
What's wrong? All that.
And that's the idea, the concept, and the embracement of what conditioning is and how to not be trapped in it is a direct link between our divinity and our humanity.
Ah, nice.
You see, unless
Mm-hmm.
we address conditioning, we're never going to make the Gestalt way down line of identity, the stage of identity, where it's all one Gestalt. You are consciously human and consciously divine, not
Because
just in your head, but
God and
everywhere in your.
reality are in one way synonymous. So if
Yes,
your
yes,
conditioning is keeping you out of reality, it's keeping you out of God too, or it's your experience of it anyway. Can't get out of that.
exactly. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a really important sequence here that I have in mind, and conditioning was the next piece. You
Yeah.
see, because without understanding that we're all conditioned, not what in other words, what you've been taught isn't absolute truth. It's
Right.
just a piece of conditioning.
And this is where
But
Meister
you're
Eckhart said your belief in God prevents your experience of it. That was like the
yes,
barest of beginnings at looking at how conditioning
yeah,
stops one from actually abiding with divinity.
exactly. So how does let's unpack conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what are the mechanisms that get us over-conditioned or mal-conditioned, right? There's three aspects mostly to the human map. Now we'll go to the human map for a moment. We'll go back and forth here, not finish one and go to the other. Human mapping, how we perceive and how we abstract what we perceive into a belief, is affected by three domains that identity really starts as a foundation. One, the reconditioning of identity involves addressing three domains: the unconscious, that the self is not anti-spiritual by nature innately, and that we're always the third one.
Are we talking about the three principles of identity? Oh, I did. Yeah. I pulled those off a couple days ago. The self is the
spiritual in itself,
and then we're emotive beings first. Isn't that the third one?
And we're emotive beings first.
Yes.
Those
the hardest
three.
List in identity to remember for some reason.
and I incepted the bloody thing, and I still forget. It's when you are busy being it, you forget how to abstract it.
I guess
the more the being, you're so busy being it, you can't get out of thinking about it.
And the first one is not just that the unconscious exists, but that we're responsible for the contents of it. That's
the next more sophisticated. We'll sophisticate each one of those for the moment.
Sophisticate. I love that. Okay.
Yeah.
To make something sophisticated. Yeah, we don't have a verb for that.
No, we don't. I had to make it up. I thought about that earlier today. So we have to sophisticate those three. So let's start with the unconscious. Exactly what Joseph just said. There are many people most people on the planet live as if there isn't an unconscious.
Yes.
That they think they've been conditioned, malconditioned, that who and what you are is who and what you are aware of about yourself. That sounds simple, but this is one of the reasons why the world is such a mess, is that people have been malconditioned to think that everything they are is what they're aware of they are. And everyone is fused, 2/3 of the planet anyway, 90% of the planet is operates as if there's no unconscious motives hanging around in your unconscious that affect your intentions, that affect your actions to create your outcomes. In other words, the most we are aware of, well, I intend to do that. I intend to do that. That's as far as we go. That's not even down to that's not down to the root though.
And then when you say, what happened to your intention to do that? They go, oh, I've been really busy. I got busy. You know how it is half the time. Yeah, yes. I tried hard. I'll try harder. Won't happen again.
Identity says there's no way to make a foundation out of intentions, because there's one layer deeper, and that is unconscious motivations. Mm-hmm. We all have an unconscious, and as Joseph just said, first point, as I just said, we're completely unaware in an everyday life moment that we have an unconscious. And so the remedy here is that identity offers that we are all responsible for the content of our unconscious.
And to add on to this, the unconscious is just fine with us not realizing that. I use the wizard behind the pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. That's the unconscious. It's working overtime to make sure it stays unconscious. And that's I love that line from the first Batman movie. It was stolen from Baudelaire. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was proving he didn't exist.
Yes, exactly. And see, Christians still use that. I see that all the time in inferred and direct ways. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, the road, what's the thing? The road to blank is
road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Exactly. And what Joseph said earlier there, why don't intentions always work? Mm-hmm. No matter how much willpower we juice our intentions with, right? So these are what we're talking about here. I want listeners to not just hear this as descriptions of structure, but how it actually applies to you, to you. To the listener, 2/3 of who and what you are is driven by unconscious motivations underneath your conscious intentions. And not only that, but those unconscious motivations are wounded. We'll come back to that in a moment. Mm-hmm. So not only is there an unconscious running your life, and the degree your unconscious is running your life, take this in, slow and easy. The degree your unconscious is running your life is the degree you're not aware of how much the unconscious is running your life. That's the best measurement of that. And the antidote, and then we'll be finished with this 1/3 of why we are malconditionable, right? Is that we're responsible for that unconscious. Jung tried to beat the drum for the unconscious. Freud, he had a different version of the unconscious, mostly filled with a lot of sexual bandwidths.
Sex and aggression.
Sex and aggression, right? But Jung talked more about. Jung was more a fan of the East, and he knew that there were existential aspects also to the unconscious. But he also really clearly wanted to link situational experience with our unconscious, and so did Freud. But that piece is what psychology is based on, of course. But these days, the unconscious has become way more practicalized, as we've said in other podcasts. What works, mm-hmm. not what doesn't work. Mm-hmm. In other words, it's all about finding out, let's just, throw the dice and what works. Let's try this, try that, try that. It's way more practicality driven now.
What works to control the unconscious, basically. Control it, exactly. Channel it, which is just a kind of controlling.
Exactly.
Like, are you depressed? Eat some chocolate, take a walk. And so there's a recognition that there's something happening with the unconscious, but it's coming from still a will-based. How do we change the behavior, not how do we explore and get curious and actually heal what's there? I mean, Western medicine does not use the word heal with anything related to what they call mental illness. They only treat, and they then imply that treating and healing or curing are all synonymous. But
they wouldn't say that, but that's what they do.
Right. Well, the treatment is you take this pill for the rest of your life, and everybody wins. You feel better, and we get tons of money, and we don't have to go mucking around in things you don't want to look at. I don't want to look at it myself, and we all get to pretend everything is, well, not great, but it's okay. It's really heartbreaking.
Heartbreaking is the right word. So, well, that's as much as about the unconscious. If you're a listener, I promise you have one. And the degree it's running you is the degree you don't know how much it's running you, and that it is wounded. We'll come back to that.
I want to insert this just briefly. I saw an Instagram video today. I forget who it was or what mass shooting it was, but it was a teenager it was a film of a kid. Maybe he probably was over 18 at that point. They showed his reaction while they played footage of his mass shooting in a courtroom, and he just had his hands on his head and his head down, and he was just shaking his head, and everybody was just quiet and basically ignoring him. And here was this kid, he couldn't have been older than early 20s, who was just in the throes of deep, deep shame and self-punishment about what he did, and everybody just left him completely alone. And it just, oh God, it was awful, because it's like, is this a kid that needs to be punished? Like, do you think that punishing him here is going to actually help him not do something like that again? He's already tortured by what he did. And so while he's feeling the shame of it, no one's with him, and that's where the healing would be. Oh my God, it made me crazy.
Yeah. Now, that doesn't mean Identity doesn't say there are consequences to mass shootings. But what Joseph's point here is that his unconscious was coming conscious to him that he didn't have while he was doing the shooting. And no one saw that, and only operated on the action, not the unconscious that drove it. And at least he was having shame about that. So the point Joseph's making here, to be crystal clear, is that it doesn't let him off the hook for consequences, but for healing, which doesn't happen in jails in prison very well, obviously. There's something we're missing here, and it does fall under the category of the unconscious.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. The second element on this tripod, of course, is that there is nothing unspiritual about the dualistic self. This applies to both the West and the East. The East, of course, in its esoteric way, says that it doesn't exist, it's an illusion. So right there, it's the ultimate existential level shaming of a sense of self or ego, as they say.
And you got to be really careful here, because when you say that to a Zen Buddhist, for example, they'll say, "Oh yeah, no, there's nothing wrong with the self. You don't negativize it. It's just illusory or less real than the non-dual." And it's like, well, no, it's an aspect of God, right? Like everything else. And so people will make it sound like they're not negativizing the self, but you have to have really well-trained ears to be able to hear it, because it is there.
Well, of course, since there's no God in the Eastern esotericism, it's resonant. Their paradigm is resonant. But there's even a more incisive way, in addition to that can help sometimes, and that is that just because they don't resist the ego and that they accept the ego doesn't mean that they're still not absolutely defining it as illusory. And I used to say this to my early people would come at satsang with me, is that the way to test your guru that he's just accepting ego is, well, do you accept then that the ego it could be an illusion, or maybe it's not an illusion, which is the Buddha's beginner's mind, right?
Yeah.
The Buddha taught no absolute positions about anything.
Mm-hmm.
Ask him, is there a soul after death? The Buddha would say, well, no, after we die. Mm-hmm. Anything that you would say about it is going to be an imponderable or something that you make a theory about, and then you're bound to attach to your theory. And that's what the Zen and Advaita Vedanta, in different ways, they over-attach to their theory of why it's an illusion. It's non-dual, or it's samsara, and there's blends of both there.
Just like Gangaji's, if you think you need therapy, then you need therapy. Just in that one line is a paradigmatic assumption that, well, if you think you need this, then you need this, parentheses, but ultimately you'll get that the self is illusion and be done with all of that. And that frames the therapy.
Yes,
and
that
limits
frames the therapy. Right. We have several podcasts where we say that one of the greatest oxymorons is the term Buddhist psychologist, right? Because yes, we'll sit and bake. We'll take your money while you bake the illusory source of your illusory suffering until you're ready to realize that the source is as illusory as all your fussing and doing about your suffering.
Right. And guess what? So, certain levels of unconscious stuff will not come out if that's how you're framing it, because they know that there's a level of engagement they need that isn't there yet.
A Zen master's tradition was born in a pre-psychological era. Mm-hmm. So there's no impetus to study the unconscious in that way. The best they can do is say, well, we're transpersonal psychologists. Another way to say a non-dyed-in-the-wool Buddhist psychologist. We accord that there's something bigger than the person, but it's not what the religions say, and there's something that's really something else there. Then it kind of drafts and allows a little more unconscious to come into the picture. But they're not tuned in, because in the end, why should they? And so the point I want to make here is, just because you don't resist the ego or accept the ego or don't negativize the ego, if you say Guru says, I don't negativize the ego, we'll say, well, but you say it's an illusion. Well, that's not negativizing, it's just a truth.
Right.
But it's the ultimate negativization. It says the Buddha never said in his picture, the Buddha, and you can look this up, The Buddha doesn't say we have to kill the ego or get rid of it. It says we just have to realize it never existed in the first place.
Yeah, right.
That's a very different orientation than some of the, especially Tibetan Buddhism, which likes to stomp
It's
on it on
try
stage.
like, I'm not saying that you're stupid. I'm just saying your intelligence is an illusion. Like, that's not negative. It's just not there.
Yeah, it's just the truth, right? But it's an existential negativization of the ego if you say it's an illusion.
Yeah.
What could be worse erasure of its sobriety than that it doesn't exist?
Oh, no. It's freedom. When you realize that the self is an illusion, there's a freedom there. It's not negativization. It just feels negative to the ego, right? And then once you fully accept it, then you're free. So it's only negative as long as you're still attached to it.
And we'll come back to this also. The reason you get a liberated feeling relative to the next element of the tripod of identity is because the unconscious wounded part of you finally is relieved that it doesn't have to do anything anymore.
Yeah, the babysitter gets to think that the children it's been left responsible with don't exist.
Yeah.
So your job is done. You weren't doing it terribly, and now you can stop doing it and just go upstairs to Transcendence Land and leave them behind. And now your job is done.
No, and exactly right. And just because they say an ego is an illusion, and we would say that's just pre-psychological projection stuff, doesn't mean that there isn't something to what they call non-duality, which we call pre-duality.
Right.
So we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The one thing that the East does get right, that there is some impersonal bandwidth to existential reality. Absolutely, the identity maps that. But it's not the end all, the be all. It's just a segment of it in a certain way. And now we come to the most important of all. Why have we not been led? Why have we been malconditioned to not realize we have the unconscious to the degree of 2/3 of what makes us, right? And we don't realize that that there's nothing unspiritual by the teachings of the East and the West. Oh, we didn't say. The West says it's originally sin, like Joseph said. That's retail negativization. But the East says it doesn't exist at all, which is wholesale negativization.
Right, and the East points to the original sin as a way of saying, see, we don't negativize it like that, therefore it's not negativizing it.
Oh, God. It's so frustrating to see intelligent people get duped by this. So now the linchpin that links these two, the unconscious and the fact that the self is not unspiritual in itself, the personal ego, that we are emotional beings first, energetic beings second, mental beings third, willful beings third, mental beings fourth, and physical beings fifth. We can make a couple of different arrays of that. The seminal teaching of identity is that we've mismapped the ego as made of will, energy, illusion, or mentality. In other words, what gives there's so much cachet to the East in one way, because they say that the self doesn't exist and is only a function of the way the mind cathects our experience or internalizes our experience, right? They say that the self is entirely mentalized, an ephemera of mentalization process. And that's saying that the I is essentially mental sourced, right? We're saying no. That's a misinterpretation actually of what Descartes meant by I think, therefore I am. He didn't mean thinking is all that there is to you, just that if I think, then I have relevance to my own reality. That's actually what he meant. A lot of people don't know that. I think, therefore I am is not just a functional thing. For him, it was the way he broke away from the dark age, that you didn't have a right to your own reality. I think, I imagine, I dream, therefore I am. In his world, all those things are thinking processes. It's true, but it's a little different than how a lot of people understand it. It was the break with that you don't have a right to exist. In the old teachings in the West, where you're so originally sinned, you're hopeless. Right?
Yeah, it's a subjective centered, the self as center of the reality rather than God or the church first. Yeah, that's the break.
Exactly. So identity comes along with the first time in history, and I say this humbly and with aplomb in some way, that it can be self-verified that we are emotive beings before we're ever mentalized or physicalized. Let's do it simply here first. So that means if we are emotive beings first, that means that where we start to look at the proof of that is in the unconscious, one of the other legs of the tripod, that we have emotive-based wounding in our unconscious, all of us, from the lack of, and here's we come to our second connecting thing beside conditioning, in childhood. No child in the history of human incarnative, let's say, existence, we offer that no child has ever gotten what they actually need. Now, there's an asterisk to that. 2/3 of the planet are made of very young souls where it doesn't matter that they don't have an unconscious. They're just getting their feet wet, right? They don't have the responsibility to be responsible for their unconscious because they don't have the capacity. And like a child, and a 7-year-old doesn't have the capacity to understand conditioning of social norms into our world. It's just beyond their capacity. So we're talking about the other 1/3 of the population that are a little older souls and more advanced souls, for the fact that we've got to be responsible for our unconscious, because the vast majority of people on the planet are younger souls, and they're innocent completely of this. I've never had a Terran, a young soul, come to an identity event. It's just off their radar, as it should be. We're talking about something else, but it links to what we said last podcast. When we say the kids are in charge of the family of humanity, what we're saying is it's time for the elders of humanity to step up and start to make a difference, and not let the kids anymore run the entire show. It's time we start guiding the younger aspects of our human brothers and sisters into more cogent reconditionings, instead of what they've been fed east and west by really radically incomplete and many times disastrous malconditioning.
The problem is that there's more of them. And
there's more of
this
them.
is why democracy doesn't work, because it assumes an informed electorate, and then you end up with leaders who represent. I always think, do you want a leader who represents your level of consciousness intelligence, or do you want one who eclipses it? I want leaders that are smarter than I am. I don't know about you.
And more self-aware.
More self-aware. But it takes an aware and a smart person to want a leader who's more aware and smart than they are, right? Instead, people want someone who they look at as the same or maybe a little bit more. Oh, I can relate to the guy. I like him. I don't care whether I like the person. Are they better at running a country than I am at it?
You bet. If you don't want someone more equipped to run the country than you, then take a look in the mirror. You've got some issues.
Yeah.
But another point here is I want to make about this is the American judicial system. Boy, what a thing it was, wasn't it, Joseph? When this came out of England, it did, but the complete institutionalization of a trial by your peers.
Yes.
Is really, it sounds great, but I would offer it's awful. What happens is
it's a trial by people who are not smart enough to get out of jury duty, which is that's below average.
Joseph is not wrong here in this. I wouldn't say it in those words, but he's exactly right.
It's just like when you get labs done in Western medicine and they compare your lab values to the averages. Those averages are sick people, right? That's already skewed down. So those averages are already skewed to the unhealthy.
By contrast,
Yeah.
Sweden, Germany, even France, a little different, but a judicial system where there's one judge who's orienting the whole circus, but an odd number of highly trained, clearly legal experts
Mm-hmm.
are in charge of deciding whether or not the person is guilty or not guilty of the charge that they're charged with. You need legal experts.
Yeah.
I want legal experts.
And I realized what I said was a little arrogant and disdainful, but I want to add in my defense, I served on a jury once, and for 3 days it was amazing. I was so glad it happened. And then I was called again in Oregon to a grand jury, and I got as far as being inside the box. And I was really watching, what's that, the joie something, the voir dire, I think they call it, the jury selection process. And I was really watching the questions they were asking and how they were selecting. And I was very clearly taken off the jury for being intelligent. I just saw the questions they asked and how they were looking to get a lower level of intelligence people, at least one side was. So they don't want smart people on juries because they're more nuanced. It's harder to make a compelling case for those people. They don't want that.
Lawyers, both prosecution and defense, want people they can sway who don't have a solid center in them.
And the jury I was on was fascinating. I'll just briefly in 30 seconds say what happened. It was to me extremely clear what the right side was. And when we went into deliberations, we did a quick vote, and it was like about 60-40 split. And I was so shocked. First of all, I volunteered to be the leader of the jury thing, the foreman. So I asserted that because I knew I would get it done faster and I could go home sooner, right? So my self-interest is already operating. And then when I saw the 60-40 split, I was like, wow, did you guys see the same trial I did? And I talked for like 2 or 3 minutes and we were done in 10. I just convinced the whole room to go with how I saw it. And I think it happened to be right. But that's exactly why you don't want a smart, powerful person on a jury.
No.
I should have been taken off that jury just by how persuasive I was. They don't want someone like me in that. So, yeah.
The point we're making here, bringing in the judicial system in America as a good metaphor for it, is that peer judgment is not the way to go. We want experts, but they have to instruct the jurors of the legalities involved. The judge has to go through a whole thing.
In like 5 minutes. Here's the relevant. I know you didn't go to law school for 3 years plus, but here's what you need to know in 5 minutes or less. Okay, does everybody understand? Are there any questions? Okay, now you can judge your peer. Oh God.
And here we come full circles. Exactly, Joseph. Here's we come full circles to conditioning.
Yeah.
Another way to say is that both the prosecution and the defense want people who are conditionable to their slanted bias, in most cases, conditioning. Right. They're going to try to condition the jury to it doesn't matter what the truth is. My brother's a lawyer. It doesn't matter what the truth is to lawyers. It only matters what can be proved.
Yeah.
And that is an amoral system that has no link to spirituality, no links to real truth. When it says proudly, we don't care what's true, only what can be proved. That is a function of young soul consciousness running our world. Mm-hmm. They're not sophisticated enough to run our world. Identity is a call to middle-aged souls and older souls to step up, as I said a moment ago, to realize that we can't do that. We can't lead the world until we take care of our unconscious. The fact that we've been malconditioned in our spiritual orientations, whether that spirituality is atheism, that's still a spiritual issue.
Still a belief system. Yeah.
Right. So, in that sense, in the bigger picture that we're working on here, why is the world such a mess? Because of poor mapping of the human and the spiritual world. We're talking about the poor mapping in the human world right now, and how it affects the chaotic truth and mess of our world as it is right now. So when if we diagnose, as identity does, we're responsible for the content of our unconscious. That's 1/3 of the map. So the self is not inherently unspiritual or an illusion, the ego, and we are emotive beings before we're any other kinds of aspect to our being. When you combine that together and then build a dharma on top of those foundations, you get our personhood path. The personhood path and identity maps the nature of the human and has a process to emotively process it for the first time in recorded history. And that's honest to God truth. And we're not saying that makes me or identity any more true than it might be or not. But it is the first time this has ever been offered. Not only the foundation, but a dharma that emotively combines those three into a process called personhood. When you go through personhood and EBE, you become more and more, you become less and less driven by unconscious motives and more conscious of health, the difference between healthy motives and wounded motives. Mm-hmm. And that creates more than the 2/3, one day, more 2/3 clear of the unconscious, where you're only 1/3 still unconscious and 2/3 more conscious. That is the map of the human that identity offers.
And another way of saying that is you're driven by your soul's motives rather than that which covers your soul because it's afraid of what might happen to it.
Yeah, that brings in it opens the door to what we mean by soul. Mm-hmm. Now that's the map of the human. We don't there's a soulful component, but we have to come in the spirit door now to link it to the human. So now we're going to talk a bit about how divinity of the divine being that is, what's our version of that? In other words, identity maps the spirit as the fact that what Joseph said earlier, the I, the ego, which is only determined to be made of mentality in empiricism and esotericism of the East, mm-hmm. a product of mental activity. Illusion on one sense, in original sin on the other in religion, or it lights out at death. There's no soul in either of those. So in that sense, the soul is what links, the first most basic thing that links the divine with the human. And what Joseph just said, in personhood, the map of our humanness involves the soul. Mm-hmm. And we, for the first time, that's the beginning of linking our humanness, self-awareness that we're aware we're self-aware, that ego, that we're aware that we're self-aware. That's how we define ego, awareness that we're self-awareness.
Yeah, so
different than animals.
This is, I didn't think of it quite this way, because the self is inherently spiritual. Healing local personality self issues lead to spiritual ramifications.
Spiritual emergence.
Exactly.
The ramifications of emergence.
With no intention whatsoever, and that's how it's verifiable. All sorts of soul level spiritual stuff happens without having to practice it, will it, intend it, try it, etc. Which can be difficult sometimes.
Absolutely, but look at this prima facie, if I'm pronouncing that right, assumption here, is that the emotive-based psychological work in identity creates emergent self-awareness of our soulfulness. Without praying, without having a certain belief system.
Without meditation, without practice. And if we invert that and point to a psychological model that doesn't see the self as inherently spiritual, which generally does not produce spiritual results, well then who or what are they working with?
Yes.
We would say not the soul, not the
Not the
essence.
soul.
What they're doing is helping the protector of essence cope better, which they
Yes.
more or less admit in many different circumstances, that they're exchanging poor, unproductive coping mechanisms for better coping mechanisms, which I mean, I wouldn't say it makes spirituality any worse. It just moves horizontally, and it's not going to have
That's
spiritual
right. Right.
emergence.
Yeah. If you walk around a mountain at exactly the
Yeah,
same altitude, every moment you'll get a different view.
yeah,
But you're stuck at the same horizontal level. You're not deepening.
yeah.
So our psychological framework is creates soul emergency, and I mean that in that other firm. Emergency
Mm-hmm.
is always gets everybody scared. Oh, I don't want an emergency in my life. But we willfully help people through emergency, the emergency of the soul coming more forward out of the unconscious and healing the wounds emotively. So the
Including
first,
emotional wounds from past lives, which is part of the soul
and
thing.
we haven't talked about reincarnation yet, but yes,
Okay.
exactly right. Right. So that's the next link in how we slowly help people to realize their divinity.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the second piece here is that you've got to you don't have to do anything. Identity invites you to consider that reincarnation is self-verifiable. It's not just woo-woo stuff from the empiricist point of view. It's not like the East version and identity of what reincarnation. Reincarnation, you can't reincarnate from another species. We weren't cows in a previous life, according to identity. You can self-verify this, but if you can't co-create, if you can't make a baby with another species, then you can't incarnate as that species. There's some exceptions to that in the animal kingdom, but not in the human kingdom.
Yeah.
Animals are aware, they're self-aware, they're intensely connected to the ramifications of their environment on themselves. They're really self-aware. They experience love, they experience terror, they're aware, but they're not aware that they're self-aware.
Yeah.
That one extra level is part of being a human being, and that distinguishes us from animals. So this undermines every anthropological paradigm there is out there, that we're just animals with an oversized cortex, right?
Oh, right. They just see it as brain size, which
Yes,
doesn't.
brain
Yeah, it
size.
doesn't make a lot of sense because there are animals with very large brains, like I don't know, elephants and whales and whatnot.
Right. Now, so it's another whole thing for us to talk about directly how identity sees incarnation works relative to the soul choosing certain human attributes in any one lifetime to grow so that the soul becomes more and more emergent to the interface of everyday life, right? So in that sense, reincarnation is another linchpin here that makes all this hold together coherently. If you don't have reincarnation, then you have one life to get all your unconscious healed and make a connection to divinity. And what? No, they've segmented. All of our teachings have segmented. Afterlife is afterlife. Human life is human life. And what you do in the human life only tells you what you're going to get in the
No, you
afterlife.
just have one life to follow all the rules and be a good little human, and you'll be forever rewarded. And what does that sound like? What kind of projection, father projection, is that onto God?
So now once you soulful eyes, and I've gotten to the point where I can't separate it anymore and make one word out of it. We're emoto soulful beings. Soulful means emotive, heartful, connectable, vulnerable. That's soulful.
Mm-hmm.
Once you do the personhood dharma, which starts to get your soul emergent in your conscious personality and starts outshining that personality, the wounded personality you were, the protective personality you were before the personal work in identity, In other words, there's an outshining. It's a spiritual process. It's psychologically flavored, but our personhood dharma is spiritualizing human beings by getting their soul to be more aware in their human incarnation than their wounded unconscious is. This is a seminal distinction that's never been made or offered in a codified dharma before.
Yeah.
This is why for 40 years we've been baking this, gone through a couple of iterations, and we finally got, I think, a serviceable one that's got much less distortion in it than it used to be in our trial and error deal here. To bring a new paradigm of the human condition and the divine condition, I'll tell you, it is an MFer. I can tell you it is really hard, and and we've made mistakes along the way, and we've learned, in my opinion, basically from most of them. So in that sense, personhood, you're 1/3 of the way there to knowing and experiencing what divine is by starting with your own local version of it. Okay. Now if you want to expand that, okay, I've got my soul's now 2/3 of me and I'll be working on my
unconscious.
Hold
on. But what's that like though? People are going to want to know. What's that like? What's the experience
Thank you.
of it?
I was going to end with that, but let's say that here. The fruit of soulful personhood is, you could call it grace, but it unpacks as three things: kindness, courage, and curiosity. In other words, that's what identity would offer. The grace of being human involves kindness to self and other, courage to be what you are against your conditioning, and curiosity always to realize that any attainment you make in your soulfulness emergent echelon, still there may be more pieces to go. In other words, the state of personhood in identity, it's not a state, it's a stage, because every state has unfolding future to it. In other words, everything is an asymptote. There is no final state in any process, personhood or other two I'll get to in a moment.
Even pure Zen would say that.
Yes, it's always unfolding. There's no end to it's. Any state is an asymptote to the next state. So every state is a stage in your overall consciousness growth. Okay, so once you can embody kindness, courage, and curiosity. Curiosity offsets grabbing on too hard to any of your motives for kindness or motives for courage. Curiosity will always be the offset to that. That's what we'd call grace in the human. Now, once we have that and we embody that, and if you will embody that, it means you've healed. That's an arduous, years-long slog of situational and existential healing of the unconscious that is no weekend seminar. So it's only for the really committed maniacs, right? The middle and older souls on the planet. It's not for, they've got psychology in the younger souls, but there's nothing to heal in younger souls. You don't say, hey, to a 7-year-old, hey, you're not developing your internal self-worth very much. And that's, by the way, to say, when you add if you can embody kindness, courage, and curiosity, you have attained what psychology calls self-worth, but identity would call the state of self-worth or self-love, which is thrown around out there in paradigm land, is the feeling of it as self-goodness, self-goodness, all the way down to the existential, all the way down, not just a situational the thing that can be lost, but a permanent seat of feeling self-goodness. That's self-love. Self-love is a really iterative kind of weird thing to say. It doesn't have a referent in reality
Yeah, you can people turn it
identity.
into a practice, and that's not
Yeah,
the point. Is it shouldn't need re-upping or practice. It's just there.
oh, it's just there. And
Mm-hmm.
think of a permanent state of self-goodness. You would exhibit that, express that as kindness, courage, and curiosity. The courage to even be vulnerable, the courage to help others in need, against being maybe afraid they don't want your help, whatever that involves. So once you attain that, now you've got your feet in spirit. Now we want to get your wings into spirit with more dharmas, sagehood dharma and sainthood dharma, that gives you a way to remap what divinity is. There's never been a teaching that has the non dual goal of the East and the divine self aware God of the West. There's never been a map that includes them both. Wilber's integral theory may seem like it does, but it doesn't, because in the end, the whole paradigm of integral theory is based on a foregone conclusion that the self is an illusion.
Yeah.
So it's not an open-ended metathesis of East and West. It's simply an apologia for the non-dual
Yeah, it
perspective.
sees the human development as a vehicle for the transcendence of it, basically.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's beautiful. I hand it to the guy. He's a five, I think. And he was really inspired, but I would love to just hug Ken.
I think the diamond
He's
approach, almost work, is similar in that way. Is
it
it's a
is.
curiosity and interest in humanity with the intention of not getting rid of it, because that would be too negative.
Right.
Realizing it's not as important as, or illusory
Yes,
and relative to, which we would see as negativizing.
exactly. Things like Diamond Heart and Waking Down, they make an
Yeah.
attempt, but at the end game for all those is that to recognize that either the self is an illusion, or whatever is God is totally impersonal, featureless being,
Mm-hmm.
impersonal being. All right. So, in that sense, uh, sagehood and sainthood now will help you not. We have maps of what sagehood is and sainthood, the non-dual, what that is and why it's there, and sainthood, which is where your
Let
will,
me insert a personal example here about the kindness, courage, and that's a new list for me to
curiosity.
learn. Curiosity, yeah. I've been working with some really, as you know, Stace, deep levels of existential terror over the last 2.5 weeks. And one of the things that I've noticed has happened without any intention, without any having to practice it, is I'm just a lot kinder with people. And it just naturally happens. And it's like, huh, why is that? Oh, because the edginess that I had with people was a protector trying to keep people away in order to not feel the level of fear, the terror that was underneath that. So then I feel the terror, and then that edginess with people isn't necessary. And so that's the kind of thing we're talking about here. We're not talking about practicing, for God's sakes, we're not talking about practicing kindness like the New Age world would say. We're saying the
Right.
kindness is already there. We're looking for why isn't it in expression,
Yes.
and which is way harder. It's way
Way.
harder.
You've got to subtractedly heal your way to the emergence of kindness, courage, and curiosity. You
Yeah.
can't make it a conscious goal.
And
It's
it
not.
feels
It's not
good.
a.
Yeah, it feels good to
Yeah.
be kind with it. It doesn't feel like work. It's sort of like, oh, this is nice. It's much nicer to not be sort of subtly fighting with the world. And
Yeah.
that's what I've earned by feeling all of that fear. Will it stick? I don't know. We'll see. Never know.
Okay. So let's unwind. Let's complete this here then. Sagehood, personhood is about embodying divinity in your humanness as a start. And that's because you ensoul. You literally ensoul in personhood. And we call that an emotional body ensoulment, and not enlightenment, but ensoulment, because the soul outshines by some degree the wounded protector version of ourselves that we don't know about really clearly in psychology doesn't map it very well, because it does not based on emotional first of human consciousness. So you get to begin your journey with personhood, but then to expand your journey and get your wings, to take a metaphor, into divinity, to have an experience of divinity. You can't do it while you're burdened by the unconscious, your human unconscious. You literally can't all the way get what pre-dual or non-dual means and how to be with it while you are got unconscious congestion. That doesn't mean Osho and all the Enlightenment people, Adi Da, all these people, Byron Katie, doesn't mean they're not enlightened, but they're enlightened in early stages. Enlightenment in our picture of sagehood is not a singular event, as Joseph said it in Zen. It evolves, and so it's always stages.
Always
But a
being,
lot of
always becoming, right?
yes, but a lot of traditions, Papaji's, especially Papaji's tradition, they forget that and they over attach to the static. There is no self. Lights out at death. That absolute position is not a becoming. It's a solid absolute. And how really intelligent people who know a bit about Buddhism tends to draw really intelligent people.
Right, like
But
John
they're
de
still-
Reuter's "I am the absolute." Like, I'm sorry, what? Like, you can't say that,
dude.
That's and that's what's going on, I think, in a lot of people. But for him, it was able to get past the edit button, and he actually stated it to be able to say, "I am the absolute." He, by the way, was convicted of sexual assault in the last year or so, but he was saying, "I am the absolute" for quite a while, surely justifying all. I mean, if you're the absolute, you can do all sorts of things, right? You're not bound by dualistic laws and mores for behavior.
Here's where identity steps in and explains all the unenlightened absolutes in enlightened gurus. They never did personhood. That explains all the cult abuses, all of it. And so if you can say I, as if any human being could know any absolute truth, that is megalomania, arrogance, narcissism. But it's written off as enlightened apologia. It's written off. Oh, he can say that because he has attained the ultimate. He didn't attain the ultimate. Bless his heart, he's a child of God too, but he did damage to people, his followers, by teaching him that that's even possible for any human being. He malconditioned them. As all Osho, who is truly enlightened, about 18, 19, it happened for him. And yet at the end of his guru career, he's on a plane surrounded by Interpol agents, hiding under a seat in the airplane, hoping not to get brought to prison.
And when he was in jail, he demanded a throne to sit in while in jail.
A lot of people don't know that, but he did. And sorry, that's another whole story.
Let me just. This is a good place to insert the principle of how we used to talk about it. Is spiritual attainment and emotional maturity are two different things. Yes. And prior to even psychology, but certainly prior to identity, they were all one thing. So because enlightenment, because Zen and really all spiritual practice was seen as a Swiss Army knife that would just do everything for a human being, because it was pre-psychological. So that's how we've inherited if you just enlighten, everything will be fine. And then I've seen this in like Adyashanti people who have real awakenings, but their awakenings are disintegrated into their humanity, and it's framed as, oh, well, it just takes some years to integrate it. And there's some truth to that, but it doesn't take nearly as long as it should or could if personhood were done first. Because what happens is, the moorings of the protector self that is not sufficiently based in soul, it's like those ropes are cut, it becomes untethered. Whereas if you have a ensouled human who then enlightens, they're already there's a rope that doesn't get cut then, because it's already an
Yes.
authentic tether to reality.
Exactly.
And
Oh, that's beautifully said, Joseph.
that's what happened with the
Yeah.
crazy enlightenments in the past, when people just couldn't
Yeah,
tolerate it.
exactly. So, in that sense, sagehood practice follows personhood. And there's a good reason why we offer that, because emotional body, emotional maturity is the net result of emotional body ensoulment. Emotional maturity, a benchmark that has never been definable, much less embodiable in our species up until now. Now we address mentality. In sagehood, we call that mental body ensoulment because it frees you from the slavery of dualism. It frees you from the slavery of dualism. Now, there's a whole mapping of what the pre-dual, non-dual is inside of divine being. We can maybe talk about next time. So I see next time talking about deeper dive in each personhood, sagehood, and sainthood. I just want to define the terrain here first.
Mm-hmm.
So, mental body ensoulment is when you are no longer living as a slave to dualism.
And identifying as mind. That's
And identifying only as mind, right? Mm-hmm. What it does, it's a sagehood in that way. When you make the mind temporarily tabula rasa in a pre-dual based enlightened ensoulment, you never go back. You can then be at choice when to accord duality some basis, but you're not slave to it anymore. And finally, when you get enlightened to the pre-dual, when your mental body and soul, now identity says, now you're ready to work on sainthood, which is folding in your attainment of sagehood, seeing the pre-dual as part of a greater divine being, which gives non-dual people metaphysical migraines. They can't imagine how the non-dual could ever be a part of anything else. And the missing piece, and this is what I'm going to talk about way more next podcast, it's always been set between duality, non-duality.
Which is a duality.
Which is a duality. Isn't that interesting?
Right.
Wow. That means there's tension there that's only solved by non-dual enlightenment. But wait for it. There's something that's always existed as a link between duality and non-duality, and that's unality. Unality. There's such a thing as unality. Halfway dualistic, halfway expansively non-dual, pre-dualistic, or post-dualistic, however way you want to say it. Sainthood focuses on the will, much deeper than mind, the next level deeper than mind. And willful body ensoulment is about negotiating reality with a very self-aware divine being that has both yin and yang aspects to it. And when you negotiate how hard it is to, now that you've got good, solid, spiritualized personhood, you're no longer a slave to duality. Now you're ready to learn about the crazy weirdness of unality that has both duality and non-duality componencies to it. And that involves making some peace with your will, your human will, with your soul's will. And if you make peace with your soul's will, which is different than your human will, as we've been malconditioned to, you'll automatically be in accordance with divine being's will for you. But your soul will, which you discover a lot both in personhood and in sainthood, has some really different pictures of expanded soulful pictures of who we are. And your soul will is going to make different decisions than your protector personality will. In other words, you don't heal all your unconscious wounded will in personhood, but you catch some of it later in sainthood when it's brought up, when it can't be spiritualized, when your will can't be spiritualized. It means you haven't yet accorded your own connection to your soul.
Right.
That's will body ensoulment.
Yeah, when you there's so many layers of control to find, and certain layers of control you can only find in resistance to aspects of the divine, because they're just like
exactly level. Right. So in that sense, to tie this all together and close for today, that's the terrain. and I'd like next time to go deeper dive in each of the souls, the dharmas, the actual dharmas, which we haven't talked. We've talked in and out about them, but I want to make a deep dive of one of all the dharma of personhood, and the next one sagehood, and that's one sainthood. What happens is the ultimate linkage is when your soul when you've had emotional body ensoulment, mental body ensoulment and sagehood, and will body ensoulment in sainthood. Now we've got another stage. If you can, those are all separate attainments, but if you can attain them in one lifetime, which is now possible, we could get into why that's possible now. It wasn't in the past so well. Then you have reached the asymptotic maximum of enheartenment. We'll stick with enheartenment is the combination, the embodiment of personhood, sagehood, and sainthood in any one lifetime. It's a nice goal to try to do all three in one lifetime, but since the dharmas for doing that are just being introduced, it's not likely that anyone listening on the podcast is going to do all three in one lifetime. I've been working 40 years for it. I'm just tasting it now, the embodiment of all three. So we're setting the seeds for future generations here. And if you'd like to be part of changing the future of this crazy world, that's a will-based world, not a love-based world, the solution is ensouling yourself and finally having the captain of your being be your soul and not your wounded human. So there's our picture of why the lack of those, why we've mismapped the human and mismapped the divine, because all of our pictures of spirituality and humanity were incepted in pre-psychological eras. It's time for a reboot.
Yeah. Amen. Wow. That was quite a lot. And with a different frequency than some new ways of talking about something we've talked about before. But it somehow feels different coming from a different angle. So I enjoyed that a lot.
So, yeah, it was a heady goal for today, and I think we just managed it. So if you're confused, you're getting it. Okay, if you're confused, you're getting it. We'll clarify some of that with going deeper dive in each of those hoods, as we call it parochially in our paradigm. In that sense, I hope this was meaningful or at least inspirational for the listeners. It really is a new kid on the block relative to paradigms, our millennial old paradigms of
and I think
humanity or spirituality.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people reasonably who they may not realize it, but they're attracted to and learning about identity so that they can do the work next life. And that's understandable too. Not everyone is an early adopter, and we don't really know whether the early adoption phase is over or not, because it's constantly evolving and not usually contradicting itself or changing in any kind of radical way, but it is getting faster. I think we can definitely say that.
Yes, absolutely. It took me 40 years to do all three in one lifetime. It may take some souls a whole lifetime to do one of those hoods, but it's all accumulative.
Yeah.
We're planting seeds for the future. You've got an oil liner, an oil tanker, and they're going 30 knots. You can't turn that big ship very, very quickly.
No.
You've got to slowly make micro moves to go 90 degrees different. And what we're trying to do here is get the human consciousness 90 degrees more toward soulful divinity, human divinity, than it is now. Going to take some generations, but we're planting the seeds this life.
Okay. Wow. All right. Thank you, listeners. Thank you, Stace. And tune in next time for, we'll go deeper into each hood. One hood at a time, you think, per episode?
I think one hood at a time. In other words, people say, well, what is the process of this person like?
I think it'd be great to go into that.
We're going to go into it for you
okay, cool.
In the best way we can.
Yeah, all right. Until then. We wish you well on your journey. Thanks for listening to the Heart of Soul podcast. To learn more about Stace Barron and Identity, please visit identity.org. To learn more about Joseph Shapiro, visit clearandopen.com. Until next time, we wish you well on your journey.